Farming and locally produced produce has always been an important part of Tuscany's wealth and independence. But despite its panoramic beauty, it can be a tough and unyielding agricultural landscape. I'm making a journey 80-odd miles south of Florence to the particularly harsh countryside of the Val d'Orcia. This is the setting for Cecil Pinsent's last Italian garden, and one of his greatest, although it was created against the backdrop of the blackest period of modern Italian history. I've come a good 2 hours drive south of Florence, and this area in particular was very poor when the garden was made. And Pinsent had to work not just with the garden as a private enclosed space, but connect it to the landscape all around. When the Anglo-American Iris Cutting married Marchese Antonio Origo in 1924, they left Florence to live in the huge but almost destitute estate of La Foce in Val d'Orcia. The Origos immediately set about renovating the impoverished tenant farms, with much help from the government's land improvement scheme. And they also commissioned Cecil Pinsent, now 43, to design the house and garden as a sanctuary from the harshness of the landscape. Pinsent applied his signature green neo-Renaissance structure. But the flowers that Iris Origo loved were from the outset to be an important part of the garden. I love the way that Pinsent does simple things extremely well, and he obviously loves hedges and uses them brilliantly. So, for example, this path has really unexpected but perfectly balanced proportions. So you have a 5-foot wide path and a wall there, and then a 1-foot high hedge, which is as wide as the path, which looks absolutely ordinary, but if you think about it, is really radical. And of course the hedge is the backside of another hedge that goes down in front of the wall. So he's created these green spaces. But when you stand here and look out, you see what he's doing with all these hedges, because the site is very awkward. It slopes down in that direction and it slopes down in this direction, and he wants to take you out towards the landscape. And to do that, he has to level the site. So instead of getting bulldozers out, he uses the hedge tops. And they start thin and they go perfectly level, and they drop down and then they level off. And the net result is when you're standing in the garden, you feel balanced. You have the harmony of the Renaissance garden. You feel centered, and then you can enjoy it. Today, Iris's daughter Benedetta lives in the villa. She knew Cecil Pinsent when she was a small child, and after a lifetime living with her garden, her respect for his design remains stronger than ever. Pinsent is credited with reviving the Renaissance garden in the 20th century and creating our concept of the Italian garden. How does this garden fit into that?
I think it's so successful as a garden just because it's a mixture. My mother was much more botanical, he was much more architectural. Also, Cecil had an extraordinary feel for nature, for the lie of the land itself. This house is oddly placed, but Cecil was not a person who would change the lie of the land. He would work with it.
So the garden is always related to the landscape?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Now, you knew Pinsent quite well, didn't you?
Yeah, I did, yes, yes. He had a lovely, dry, very English sense of humour, which you had to discover, because he was quite quiet, shy, very tall. I remember him dressed in brown tweed, which is odd, because he came in the summer and he must have been awfully warm.
Oh, poor man, he must have been boiling.
Boiling.
Much of this garden feels very familiar, and I realise it's because it's essentially an English garden. You've got Pinsent, who's an Englishman, and Iris Origio, who was brought up essentially as an Englishwoman, or albeit here in Italy. And what they've done is make an English garden that looks at its best in summer, but instead of summer being 5 days if you're lucky in July, it's at least 5 months of perfect weather.
The garden has one last section that was made after the rest was completed. This is a large cypress-lined triangle that you look down on, descending grand stone steps to box hedges that arrow into the narrow end along rather brutal lines, like blocks of troops at a rally.
It's a clever, clever piece of gardening, this, because as you walk down through it, you have all those different lines of box, green lines folding down towards the point. And that's Pinsent doing his green garden thing with supreme confidence. What it feels like here is 30 years later, there's someone at the height of his powers, great confidence, but there's a kind of brutality about it. What remains is impressive, but it's not charming.
Throughout the 1930s, as Pinsent continued work on the garden, the politics of Europe and Italy were turning ugly. The land improvement scheme that had helped to restore the farmland around La Foce had been an initiative of Benito Mussolini's fascist government, with the intention of making Italy self-sufficient in food. Now Mussolini started using Italy's great garden-making heritage as a propaganda tool, mounting exhibitions and garden tours. And in a deliberate echo of the Medici era, in 1938, Mussolini staged a public pageant in the Boboli Gardens to celebrate the visit of Hitler to Florence. The aim, of course, was to link fascism with the country's glorious Renaissance history.
The fascists paraded the Italian garden, green and strong and forthright and beautifully designed. And it was very influential. It still is, really. Still people think of Italian gardens like that. But what the fascists overlooked were the Renaissance ideals of play and charm and decoration and, above all, of humanity.
Funds from the fascist government had helped to renovate the Origo's estate. But after war broke out in 1939, La Foce became a sanctuary for Allied forces, as the Origo family risked their lives sheltering escaped British and American prisoners of war who were trying to make their way to safety. And Pinsent, who had completed his garden only months before the outbreak of war, joined the British Army as an officer. Pinsent and La Foce survived the war. And today, Alberti's Renaissance ideals that underwrote his 20th century design are as relevant as ever.
That view has become an icon for Tuscany, especially those trying to sell it for holidaymakers. I've seen it at an airport on a poster. But in fact, you hardly ever see tracks like that in Tuscany. The fields are big and open. And it was made by Benedetta's father as a completely practical thing, so that as he improved the land, you could get vehicles up to the farms that lay beyond. And that was all of a piece of the way that La Foce was made. The garden, the land was improved, the people. And actually that ties in with the Renaissance ideals of improving the villa, the garden, and the countryside around.
My visits to these gardens, both in and around Florence, has shown me that the ideals of the gardens made here 500 years ago, marshalling nature with elegant, rhythmic formality and a surprisingly rich horticultural palette, was one of the great artistic features of the Italian High Renaissance, and is something that we still instinctively respond to.
The Renaissance, for the first time, took gardens and ordered them with harmony. Instead of fighting nature and defending themselves against it, it welcomed it. It looked for interesting plants and created a space that was balanced, symmetrical, but filled with delight, and also, incidentally, filled with flowers.